Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, a cloud-centric walkthrough of MariaDB SkySQL, brought to you by MariaDB. I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Rob Hedgepeth. Rob has been slinging code since the early 2000s, building pretty horrendous-looking websites. He has since evolved and today supports a variety of projects across web, desktop, mobile, and IoT. As a developer evangelist for MariaDB, Rob combines his love for modern open source technology with his mission to fuel developers' curiosity and passion.
Thank you, DZone, for having me on. And thank you, everybody, for coming to listen to me talk about MariaDB SkySQL. And before we get started, to kind of add on to the introduction, just to put a face with the name, my name is Rob Hedgepeth, and I am the Director of Developer Relations at MariaDB. And essentially, my job is just to make developers' lives easier. That's what I focus on. So that typically means that, if there's an application or if there's an interface of some sort to interact with MariaDB to help developers learn the database and the solutions a little bit easier, typically I do whatever I can to make that as easy as possible. If you want to reach out to me, you can directly at my email, robh@mariadb.com. You can hit me up on Twitter, or you can judge my code after you've kind of seen this presentation. That may be something that you're passionate about, but you can judge my code on GitHub. Today, we're going to be talking about MariaDB SkySQL. And of course, the first thing that we want to do is actually answer, what is SkySQL? And after I've given the explanation of what it is, you're certainly going to be wondering, why is MariaDB releasing this now? Why is it important that SkySQL be something that the developers and technical audiences really want to be interested in and use? And then we'll dive in a little bit of how SkySQL is different to really answer that question of why now. And we'll start to wrap things up with a demonstration, because if you're like me, seeing some slides and getting in it some information or some text is one side or one piece of the puzzle, but I certainly love to see something in action. And once we've done that, then we'll take a look ahead at the roadmap for MariaDB SkySQL and show how really we're just getting started. So first things first, what is SkySQL? And to really answer that question, we really first need to start at a real baseline here. And this is really to get everybody running at the same pace. And the first thing I like to do is start with, what is a database? And I like to have a little handy image here of a bucket with this arrow showing that files can go inside this bucket. And really can be anything inside this bucket. But the idea here is that a database at its core is data or objects or something that lives inside of that bucket that persists. And unless we tip that bucket over or pitch it completely, the data or the information or the objects or whatever they are going to stay in that bucket. And so it persists. And if you're not familiar with MariaDB, the shortest answer here, shortest explanation, is that MariaDB is a database solution. It is a relational database system. So if you're not really familiar with relational databases, I'm not going to go into that, but just know that there are different types of databases out there. And we're going to first start with MariaDB as it is a relational database, and we'll kind of expand beyond that as we go through this. Next, the important piece of understanding what SkySQL is understanding what a database as a service is. So here, I've actually taken that bucket or that database, and I've simply slapped a cloud image behind it. Now, the cloud image itself is really here to function as an abstraction. It's really to show that the database itself, just like the name suggests, exist as a service. So when you access the database or you put your files inside of it to persist, you're really accessing the service. And that in and of itself is, of course, a database as a service. And of course, with MariaDB being a database, then MariaDB, which exists inside of a service or is exposed as a service, is SkySQL. So SkySQL is a MariaDB database as a service, or DBaaS for short. But why would you want to use a DBaaS, right? Well, if you're familiar with databases, you know that there's a lot of minutia or a lot of, you know, very ground level types of tasks that you have to perform in order to be able to get databases up and running. First, you need to provision a machine or machines, depending on what your setup is. Then you need to configure the database with all kinds of variables and system metrics in order to tailor the database to your needs and your products and applications needs. And maybe you even need to consider security considerations and how you access the information, even how you store the information. Now, we won't dive too much into this particular part, but just know that, you know, the list goes on from here, and it can be a pretty complex set of operations to not only start, but really to maintain going forward. And so the dream of a database as a service is so that you can focus on this left-hand side of being able to write code or, you know, being able to perform essentially your job duties without really having to worry about the database. And so a database as a service then provides this form of an easy button or a very easy way of spinning up a database that you can access on this left-hand side for your job. And of course, as developers or anybody really, you know, within tech, there's a level of control that we like to have, right? We like to have it in the solutions that we build. And, you know, we certainly want to have that even if we're abstracting away certain things about a database. And so a database as a service in its, you know, dream form really allows you to have these levers and knobs and buttons to be able to configure the database the way that you choose. But if you're familiar up until this point, or you've heard, you know, databases as a service and you're familiar with the concept, you're probably thinking, okay, Rob, it's 2020, right? Why do we need this now? There's options out there, right? And we won't go into the different database vendors that are available, and there's certainly a lot of them and they fit different needs. But if we're focusing just on MariaDB, even so, there's options out there that allow us to be able to spin up a database as a service and use that within our applications, right? And the promise of a database as a service, as we started to get into, is that, well, one, they're easy to use from the cloud, right? You abstract it away to be able to use that. And for MariaDB specifically, they're using MariaDB Community, which is a very popular open source solution, a MariaDB platform, which is available out there in a variety of types. And it allows you to do a variety of development and testing. It's got a very high rate of developer adoption. And inevitably, we want to be able to use self-service. So certain cloud providers, now there are more, but we'll list these three just to get started. AWS for Amazon Web Services, Azure, and Google Cloud all provide some form of databases. And AWS actually has, through something called RDS, or Relational Database Services, a form of MariaDB. And so does Azure and Azure databases. And if you use this database as a service, right, you actually need to combine that with a MariaDB subscription to get the full effect, right? So because we're using MariaDB Community, you actually don't get native MariaDB support within the database itself. And so you would need to latch on MariaDB subscription through MariaDB in order to really kind of dive in and get that support for the MariaDB platform. Now, the reality of this is that, well, while you're getting some features, certainly from MariaDB, there's certain things that are missing, right? Because there is an enterprise version that exists, which we'll get into. But as you're using Community, you're actually using a watered down version, and you're not taking advantage of things like multi-master clustering. You're not able to get sharding like you would expect inside of a database these days. And so you may think to yourself, well, we'll just make do and kind of work around it. But as time goes on, you start to understand that the database that you're using, primarily the Community version of the database that you're using, is missing certain bug fixes, as is the case a lot of times in Community versions. It may not have up-to-date features. But still, you say, we'll be patient. We'll find a way to work around some of the features that aren't available, like columnar storage to allow you to perform real-time analytics. What you don't know maybe necessarily doesn't hurt you, but ultimately you'll run into an issue where even though you're getting support through MariaDB, you're not getting the full version of support that you'd expect, right? As they're not able to actually access your database and provide full technical support, workarounds, and even hot fixes to fix certain issues. And so you're really in trouble at this point. Well, if we go back to the diagram I had previously shown, we have another option. Obviously, you could bypass database as a service altogether, and you could use the community version of MariaDB, or you could use the enterprise version of MariaDB, and you could use it infrastructure as a service, something like EC2 in Amazon, or roll some virtual machines in order to slap MariaDB on there. You could combine that with the MariaDB subscription, but ultimately you'd be missing out on a lot of the key features and abstraction provided by databases as a service, such as self-service and a lot of the automation that you expect to be able to ease your mind and not have to worry about the database. And up until SkySQL, these were really the best available options. And so that takes us really into how SkySQL differentiates itself from the current solutions, or now current solutions that compare to SkySQL. And namely, this is around the enterprise database as a service, as I mentioned before. We can really categorize this as third party and really a first generation database as a service, right? Where these are provided by third party cloud providers, and it's really the first iteration of MariaDB in the cloud. And you can think of SkySQL as additive, right? Where we still get everything from the ease of use to the developer adoption, the self-service, the automation, but we're adding a more native touch. And it's really the evolution of a database as a service with MariaDB, where you get on-premises reliability. Because you are using a MariaDB enterprise version, you're using the latest versions of service and reliability, customization, and ultimately that's all underpinned by the expertise and experience of the MariaDB engineers, right? You're getting the database from the source at this point. And this allows us to be able to provide certain key innovations that have been delivered within MariaDB within the last year, right? Where you're able to serve all forms and all levels of topologies, right? From small shops that maybe want to use a database as a service for development or for testing. You can use primary replicators to be able to function for applications that have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of users, and be able to expand on a dime. It's always current, so this is a really big one, right? And the fact that the bug fixes and features that you'd expect to be available in a database as it evolves over time, and as things are fixed and new security, security flaws are found, these things are fixed. And so MariaDB SkySQL stays current on the latest version of MariaDB Enterprise. And that's really because you're getting it from the source. Now, I mentioned this slightly before, but this is important not only from the database itself and the way that the actual product of MariaDB is engineered, but the database as a service and the service that's provided, and everything all the way to support. You're getting a quality, the most quality version of MariaDB. And that allows us to introduce things like smart transactions, right? Where you think about the combination of transactional or row-based storage with analytical or column-based storage. And then even the combination of those things inside of what's called an HTAP database, or hybrid transactional analytical processing, for this idea of smart transactions. Now, we won't get into that too much here, but know that the features that come with Enterprise are coming with SkySQL. And this is really because when we developed SkySQL, we focused on 4 main pillars to really prop it up. The first one that we'll dive into a little bit more even after this is the platform. We really wanted to put a focus on using the latest and greatest technologies, the best in class. And so we focused on using Kubernetes and the orchestration capabilities that it gives. We focused on using an ITSM, or an IT service manager in ServiceNow. and then Prometheus and Grafana, which allow us to do visualization and all kinds of analytics and metrics. We obviously, as I've been hinting at several times throughout these slides, be able to use the database solutions that are available. Everything from MariaDB platform to using the latest enterprise server, something called MaxScale, which I'll get into a little bit more, and the analytical features that come with Column Store. And this allows us to combine both the transactional features and the data warehousing capabilities of an analytical database. And with MaxScale, we'll actually get to jump into this idea of transparent query routing. So we actually get to balance our queries among our database servers. And finally, and probably the most importantly, is this idea of support, right? We all know that if we build solutions, especially technical solutions, we need ongoing support. Bugs are found. Security flaws are found. We need fixes for those things, and who better to have and fix those things than MariaDB experts? But enough really about the marketing side of that. The proof really is in the pudding. And in order to show you SkySQL, and later we'll get into this demonstration, it's important to highlight the architecture. And for the architecture, I kind of hinted on it before, but we wanted to focus on 3 key factors. We wanted to make this state of the art, or using best in breed technologies like Kubernetes to orchestrate containers to promote things like high availability. I mentioned before that we're using ServiceNow for our configuration and workflow, but you can think of ServiceNow as it is an ITSM as being something that really helps underpin our SkySQL portal, and it manages the workflows to allow us to communicate with the cloud service providers. And then we use things like Prometheus and Grafana for monitoring and visualization of the data that we actually are collecting inside of SkySQL. Next, really, we wanted to componentize or separate our concerns by making everything modular, right? So take, for instance, ServiceNow in the portal for SkySQL. If for some reason that happened to go down, which isn't very likely because it provides 6 nines of high availability, which is pretty large, but if it does, that doesn't mean that you can't access your database. We've created SkySQL in such a way that if a particular tier happens to be unavailable, like our interface tier, we can still be able to log in to the database and be able to get our information. And of course, and probably most importantly, we needed to make SkySQL secure. We need to compartmentalize it and isolate it in a way which heavily depends on how we just talked about modularization, so that we can be able to promote the highest form of security. But we also want to be able to log and store information anytime MariaDB or anytime anyone uses the database for all kinds of auditing and security reasons. Now, words are one thing and text on a screen only goes so far, but it's important as we start to dive into SkySQL that we throw some pictures. I'm a big picture person, and I think this really helps describe what we're trying to get across with SkySQL, right? And so we started by talking about the fact that it is backed by ServiceNow. So if we start from the top here, we can see that this really visualizes our SkySQL portal and what it's responsible for. And obviously management is used a lot inside of here, but everything from managing who uses the database to who uses, the data that's actually used for the inventory, the configuration of those databases and workflows, right? Because we know that creating a database or creating indexes, these aren't necessarily all simple tasks. They're a workflow all together in order to be able to maintain a database underneath. But the portal can really only get you so far, and so we created a SkySQL control plane which communicates to and from the ServiceNow or the SkySQL portal, and then allows us to be able to communicate with a Kubernetes API that sits in between the control plane and ultimately the database. And the reason we use the Kubernetes API is because, one, it's very ubiquitous, right? We all have probably at least heard of Kubernetes. And if we don't necessarily understand the intricacies of it, we know that it's something that, because it's ubiquitous, it's something that we can use cross cloud providers because they've got a standard API that then we can use within computational engines that exist on each of the cloud providers. So you have Google Kubernetes engine for Google Cloud, you have EKS or Elastic Kubernetes Service for AWS, and the Azure Kubernetes Service. And this allows us then to create a very flexible, scalable architecture for SkySQL. If we take a step back just a little bit and pivot really in the view that we're looking at, we're ultimately looking at the same architecture diagram, but hopefully this indicates a little bit more the flow. So if we start from the left-hand side, we can show how users will access the web UI, and they'll be able to look at everything like their inventory, obviously, look at the databases, services, and the databases that are spun up. We'll be able to control workflows for being able to create and control certain information within SkySQL. And you'll also, as we'll see later on in the demo, be able to take a look at monitoring and workflow services. And ultimately, those tasks get sent over into the cloud service provider. And first, we start with the operations tier. And the operations tier is responsible for, one, sending these tasks and creating these tasks rather to the SkySQL or the database tier. And it does that through a series of Kubernetes commands. And when it does that, then we have the ability to control the Kubernetes cluster, which in turn contains the databases. Now, we collect a series of metrics that get pulled back or sent back into the operations tier for the monitoring service, which then gets bubbled back up to us on the left-hand side so we can actually view that within the portal. Now, for the database access itself, we aren't pinned or restricted from just being able to access that from the UI. If we look on the very right-hand side and more towards the bottom, you'll see that we have a firewall set up so that we can actually access the database directly from our applications. And this is done through a process called IP whitelisting. By default, when you spin up SkySQL, you actually won't be able to access it. Nothing can access it. And you'll need to add either an IP address or a range of IP addresses so that your applications can actually gain access to it. And from there, you can use any kind of client, you can use different forms of applications, which we'll go into a little bit later on, to be able to access the database. In the middle, you can actually see that we have this term called SkyDBAs, and I'll dive into a little bit more what that means, but you can think of SkyDBAs as a remote database administrator from MariaDB that's able to access your database. Now, as you can see here, one of the security reasons, or one of the security considerations that I mentioned before, is that they aren't able to actually access the database directly. They log in through an identity proxy and then use a jump server to be able to access SkySQL. And of course, all of these things are logged, but this creates a very flexible and scalable architecture to allow us to grow and scale over time. Now, one of the things that I want to hit on before really we jump into the services and then ultimately a demonstration is this idea of high availability. And I've created this section and pinpointed this specifically because above all else, it's important that we have access to our information. When we're creating applications or we're creating reports or any kind of product that depends on data, obviously we need it to be available. And so these ideas of automatic failover and self-repair become extremely prominent to us. Well, what does that mean? Well, as I mentioned before, this idea of using Kubernetes as a best-in-class orchestration engine for containers is something that we take advantage of when we're controlling our database servers and our database instances. And if we combine that with MariaDB MaxScale, which you can think of as an advanced database proxy, and we'll go into a little bit more what that means if you're not familiar, but you actually get the best of both worlds, and it's covering quite a bit of bases here. First, you've got Kubernetes, which provides something called self-healing, right? So every database instance is going to live inside of a container, which lives inside of a node, which lives inside of a pod, which lives inside of a cluster. Now, that's a lot to take in. If you're not familiar with Kubernetes, that's essentially how it works. Now, the reason it exists like that is because Kubernetes was created really to be able to orchestrate all those pieces and recognize that when piece of infrastructure goes down, it's automatically going to recover it in this idea of self-healing, which is great from an infrastructure standpoint. But if for some reason a database instance goes down, we also have MariaDB MaxScale, which covers that side as well through a process called automatic failover, where if the primary database fails, then we'll simply promote a replica to the primary. And so let's, rather than kind of loom over this text, let's actually take a look at what I mean by this. And in this diagram, we can see we've got a very simple setup here, but this is a regional Kubernetes cluster. And inside of this cluster, we've got several zones. And we have a single Kubernetes cluster that is spread throughout this zone. And it contains MariaDB databases and MariaDB MaxScale throughout this, right? At a large scale. And we're also using persistent storage or persistent disks behind the scenes for each of the database instances. So you can imagine that each one of these contains a zonal persistent disk backup, right? Now, if for some reason the primary database instance goes down, as I mentioned before, MaxScale, as one of its duties, is going to promote what was the replica inside of Zone B to being the primary, right? And then it will go ahead and start replicating information from that primary into the replica in Zone C. And this is all very transparent and happens seamlessly without any kind of user interactions. And so the database will continue to function as expected and applications will continue to use it. But the problem now is that we only have 2 database instances that are available to us. And so this could possibly start to put a little more strain on the system. Well, that's when Kubernetes really enters the chat, right? And Kubernetes will then in turn respond by spinning up a new instance of MariaDB. And then it will create that as a replica. Now, because we have the zonal persistent disk here, we don't have to worry about loss of information. And then we can simply be able to set up the replication from now the primary that exists inside of Zone B to the replica that has been spun up in Zone A. Okay, let's take a breather and back up a little bit because we got a little bit deeper into the architecture. So now let's take a look at the services before ultimately kind of diving into a demo so we can get a firsthand look at SkySQL. Now, adding on really to the architecture, but not really diving as deep into it, I mentioned this idea of multi-node, right? Or primary replica, as I mentioned before. And that's the idea, right? That you've got several instances of a database and this scales really well and it obviously promotes high availability, but there are instances where you want to use a standalone database. And a lot of times this is used for development or testing, and you don't have the same types of concerns that you would in a multi-node or a production atmosphere or ecosystem. But it's still going to come with a lot of the services that you would expect in a database as a service. In fact, all the ones that you expect in a database as a service, right? But with MariaDB additions, you're able to use transactional-based information, analytical information, combination of the two. Obviously, I had mentioned monitoring, which we'll get into a little bit more. You have the ability to fully customize or configure the database. You have the DR or disaster recovery, which allows you to do nightly backups or point-in-time restorations. And then, of course, everything is backed by Kubernetes. So if for some reason the standalone instance goes down, you have Kubernetes self-healing to be able to bring it back up. For multi-node, you have all of those same things, but in addition, you also have the high availability that's provided by MaxScale. And of course, the scalability and performance, so that transparent query routing, the read-load balancing, and the read-write splitting so that you can really start to split and balance traffic throughout your database instances. All of that's provided in multi-node. And lastly, before we jump into the demonstration, I want to mention this idea of a SkyDBA. And SkyDBAs, as I mentioned before, are the remote database administrators from MariaDB that are certified cloud architects. They're obviously certified database administrators, and they provide a level of expertise and experience that help you bridge the gap a lot of times for developers or for shops that may not necessarily have that database expertise to go to the next level. So everything from oversight on automation to proactive types of care for health checks, performance analysis, and even getting involved in security audits. And that is MariaDB SkySQL in a nutshell. But the proof really is in the pudding, as I've said a couple of times throughout this. And I think it's important for us to actually dive in and take a look at SkySQL. And where we're going to start, obviously, is to take a look at HTTPS cloud.mariadb.com/SkySQL. And that allows us to get into the web portal. And we're going to take a tour of the web portal and see exactly what's offered inside of SkySQL. But that's really just the beginning, right? Because then we're going to take a look at what's available to us from a connection configuration option, and how do we grab that connection information so that we can use a client or clients to be able to connect to the database instance within SkySQL so that we can add our schemas, so our databases, our tables, and any information we want to import as well. And finally, we'll use 1 and 2 in this scenario to be able to culminate into connecting an application to MariaDB SkySQL. So let's go ahead and get started here. And the first place that we want to go, and this is just really a brief introduction of SkySQL, is we want to go to the Getting Started page, right? Makes sense. And there's really 2 steps here. So when you first get to the SkySQL Getting Started page, you're going to first want to create a MariaDB ID. And then once you have the MariaDB ID, you can sign up for SkySQL. And that's really all there is to it. And I will mention that we are running a $500 credit promotion right now. So as we jump into some of these instance sizes, you can see that they're small, and $500 will take you a long ways to be able to test out SkySQL. So I highly recommend it. But from there, once you've actually signed up for SkySQL, you're going to be able to navigate to cloud.mariadb.com/SkySQL. And the first time that you log in, you're actually going to be presented with the ability to start a service. And as I mentioned before, you have 3 main options within these services. You have transactions, which is a row-based approach. It's very standard, and if you're familiar with relational databases, you probably are familiar with this. You have the ability to add an analytical service, and so that's a column-based approach, which allows you to look at very large data sets and run aggregations on historical information, analytical information in sub-second time without having to use different types of commands. So you can still use SQL or the structured query language the exact same way that you expect to use it inside of a transactional database. And finally, you have the ability to create what we're indicating is both, or really a hybrid of transactions and analytics. And so you can combine both row-based and column-based storage into a single service instance, and then be able to take advantage of the hybrid database with single SQL queries. So let's go ahead and start by creating a service instance. Now, as I mentioned before, you have topologies available to you. And the first thing that you'll notice is that it defaults to standalone. And standalone, as a refresher, is when you're wanting to use it for more a development or a testing type of environment, where primary replica, as we've gone into a little bit within the architectural diagrams, allows you that high availability. From there, you're able to select a region. Now, depending on where your application lives or where your application maybe is focused, you have the option of being able to choose 3 regions within the US, 1 within Asia, and 2 within Europe. And this is a list that will continue to grow and continue to expand as the demand is there. So certainly if you're on this webinar and you don't see a region that fits for you, please let us know, and it's certainly something that we will respond to. Next, instance sizes. And you can think of this as being able to configure the size of the machine or the resources that you're wanting to allocate to your service instance. And so it will start with, if we look under CPU, this 4 virtual CPU. So think of it as 4 cores, vCPU, with 15 gigs of memory. And of course, you've got a cost analysis on what it's being charged per hour. And we have sizes ranging all the way to 32 by 120 gigs. Then you have the ability to put in your transactional storage. And so from here, you actually have the ability to choose the transactional storage amount. So the persistent disk that I mentioned before, ranging from 100 gigs to 2 terabytes. From there, you can actually enter in a name for your database. Now, some of these options aren't working for me, as you can see, because I actually have 3 services created, which I'll get into here in a little bit. But once you've done this, then you'll have the ability then to launch the service. Now, in the instance, or for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and pop over to this left-hand side for my services. Now, once you've created a service, it's going to appear on this grid as an available service for you to click into. But before we do that, I want to point out that we have this left-hand navigation for being able to view your services, the configuration manager, which we'll jump into a little bit, your account information, something called workload analysis and monitoring, which we'll certainly get into. We've got great new enterprise documentation and SkySQL documentation, and of course, direct access to support anytime that you need it. But let's go ahead and jump into an instance. And here we'll see a lot of the same information that we just saw with inside of being able to create a new instance, but laid out a little bit differently. Everything from the topology to the region that I've created this instance into all makes sense. And it's all something that we're familiar with. But we also start to see that now that we've got a spun up service, we have things like our read-write port, a fully qualified domain name, which allow us to actually access the service instance at a particular location or address, the ability to add custom configuration, and this idea of IP whitelisting. And of course, I mentioned before, this is done so that by default, nothing has access to SkySQL until you add an IP address. Now, backing up just a little bit to the custom configuration, you can actually choose a custom configuration through either a default, which is provided by MariaDB. In this case, you'll see SkySQL standalone default config, or you can provide any number of custom configurations. And so I can choose a custom configuration, and it's really that simple to get started. Now, here next to it, you'll see that it's basically noted with a version or V4, and that's for the 4th version of this custom configuration. And that is something that we can actually configure within the configuration by going to the configuration tab or configuration option on this left-hand tab. From there, we can step into custom configuration, Rob Hedgepeth V4.0, and we can see that we've got a variety of variables and system metrics available to us, or system variables available to us to be able to change. And if we suddenly come into edit action, we can actually change those. And so I can come in here and I can say, well, I want my interactive timeout really to be 600 milliseconds, or 600 seconds rather. And I can save that. And what we'll notice is that at the top hand here, we've now incremented this to version 5.0. Now this is important because if we go back to our services, back into our TX demo, we can see that we've got an asterisk now, but we haven't automatically updated it. And so it's going to remain on the previous version of configuration, and you can simply choose the version that you want to update, and it's going to automatically update it to V5. Okay, so that's the overview really of how to get around and navigate very simply the service instances within SkySQL. But what if we actually want to gain access to our database, right? That's the whole point of creating a database, is that we have some kind of product or application that needs to use the information underneath, right? So how do we do that? Well, with combination of our port number, obviously, our fully qualified domain, we can click show credentials. Then we'll see that we have a username, a password available to us to combine with those to be able to connect to MariaDB SkySQL. Now, we'll also see that we have something called a certificate authority chain. And this is a certificate that we'll use on the client side to tell the server that we have access to MariaDB SkySQL. So just another form of security to allow access and make sure that we have the appropriate access to be able to use information within MariaDB SkySQL. And then we provide a couple of steps here from MariaDB CLI or the command line interface example, which allows us to use the MariaDB client, which I'll be using today. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. Now, first thing first, of course, I do want to download my SkySQL_chain file here, or my PIM file, which allows me to gain access from the client. And then we have a couple of hints in here as far as being able to change the password, which of course makes sense from the default. And then of course, we needed to have added the whitelist. Now I've already done this, but this is something that certainly you want to remember to do, as it's a great security feature that I sometimes will forget and then I can't access it. So certainly you want to add the IP whitelist address. Once I do that, I can simply paste in my CLI. And I've previously downloaded the MariaDB client, but if you haven't, you can download it a couple of seconds and be able to do the exact same thing. Now it's going to prompt me for the password, so I need to go back here and I'm going to copy all of this text. And now that's it. That's simply all I need to be able to access it, because as we noticed, I've entered in all the user qualified information, the qualified domain, the username, and the location for the PIM file, which actually exists in my download folder. So I kind of cheated, just put it there, and I didn't change anything. From there, we can actually take a look at a command to just show databases. So something very simple to show, kind of like a magic trick, that nothing exists inside of this instance, right? So it's fresh, it's brand new. And we want to go ahead and create a new database. And I'm doing this so that we can show off an application that actually is going to use the database and the single table within inside of the orders database. And we'll call that orders as well, because I'm not very original and I like to keep it pretty simple. I'm going to call that orders as well. And I'm going to create a single table. Now, if I want to further confirm this trick or magic trick that we're showing here, I will show that we actually don't have anything inside of our table. So everything here is completely new and completely fresh. So we're doing it in real time to be able to connect to SkySQL. And there's nothing inside of our recently created table. And that's all we need to do from that perspective. Now I want to take you into an application so that we can show in real time what it's like to actually connect an application. Now, as I mentioned before, this is going to be a web application. And this web application uses a Node.js a Node.js API. And the reason for that is because I want to use the Node.js connector that's provided by MariaDB to connect to MariaDB SkySQL. Now, you could use this on an on-prem version of MariaDB. You can use this in other cloud versions of MariaDB. That's the great part about the connectors, whether it be Node.js, Python, JDBC, or any number of connectors that we offer. You can use them on any form of MariaDB. Now, this application is split up into two sections, an API and a client. The client I won't really get into as much because it's really our front end, which is a React.js application. And if you're not familiar with that, it's simply just a JavaScript interface that you can use to be able to create web applications and even mobile applications. But we won't really get into that because we're not really front end focused right now. And instead, we want to actually dive into the Node portion of this. And in this Node.js folder, we specifically want to look at a file called db.js. And this is simply a Node module that I've created, which componentizes everything or puts everything into a single component or module, which allows us to be able to communicate with and connect to MariaDB SkySQL. And there's a couple of parts to this. The first one, of course, is that we want to use the MariaDB connector. From there, we actually want to set up a connection pool. And the connection pool is going to use the information that we've already gone over inside of MariaDB SkySQL, like the host or the fully qualified domain name, the username, the password, the port. We created a database name of orders, but also we see here that we're adding SSL properties, and that's to include our certificate that we downloaded, the security or the certificate authority chain file, that we pulled down from SkySQL. And so we'll actually be able to use that directly within our connection pool. Now, as you can see, this information has been abstracted away, and this is done because I've connected, or I've pushed all this code up to GitHub, which I'll drop the URL a little bit later so everyone can take a look, and we support various different versions of APIs. But in order to connect, I actually want to create an environmental file. And that environmental file is going to contain all of the information that I mentioned before, such as the domain name, the port, the username, and the password. And we certainly just want to save that. From there, we actually just want to use the downloads. So I put up another window here, and we'll see that I only have a single file, that security or that SkySQL chain file that exists inside of my downloads folder. And I just want to go ahead and drop that directly into my project structure. And that's it. From there, I'm able to start through the command line, my API, and then I can start my UI. And those are all the steps that are needed in order to be able to connect to MariaDB SkySQL. And now we're actually reading and writing information to and from SkySQL, or from and to SkySQL. And I can change the knobs and levers here to be able to write more values or change the variation to make this graph bounce a little bit more up and down. But the point here is that we've already connected to SkySQL. And to show that, we can actually show that now we're starting to get values in real time into our SkySQL instance. And it was really just that easy. But let's go ahead and pop back over into the portal so that we can show off the last couple of bits. And the first one really being this monitoring. So before I mentioned within the architecture diagrams that we have the ability to look at real-time monitoring of the database instances. So we'll notice that when we open this, we actually need to have that IP whitelisted, which it is, and we can load a dashboard. And our dashboard is going to allow us to jump into our instances. And we can take a look at our instances so that we can get an idea of several metrics that are made available to us in real time, such as the CPU load or queries per second. We can actually dive in to take a look at more specific things about the databases, such as open connections, maybe table locks, which may be pretty concerning depending on, well, how I wrote the code, let's be real, to analyzing queries and what the breakdown of reads and writes and where you may have bottlenecks, to being able to look at system metrics such as CPU load, like I mentioned, memory usage, IO activity, and network traffic. We also have the capability of using something called workload analysis. Now, this is a tech preview, but to give a very brief introduction to this, you can think of workload analysis, and we've all probably had a conversation about this at some point or another, where we've labeled something as, you know, read or write intensive. Maybe it's a mixture of reads and writes. But when you talk about a database instance, or really a database solution, or a database that really backs your product, we know that it can be a lot more complex than that, right? It's not that a database itself is necessarily only read or write intensive. Now, there may be the case where very rarely that happens, but we know that it can certainly be more complex than that. And so what workload analysis allows us to do is combine the ability of having a ton of data or collected metrics with the power of machine learning to be able to analyze trends and patterns within our workloads. So if we load this preloaded data set up, you can actually take a look at what I mean by this. And just a quick overview, if you take a look down here, we can take a look at things like transactions per second, queries per second, and we can start to see that patterns form throughout the week. And these color codings actually tell us that certain workloads, right, as we have the hover over here, certain workloads are happening at certain times of the week, certain times of the day, and we can really start to dive into how our databases are operating. And this allows us then to be able to create correlations and similarities and really compare certain features, which then allow us to be able to fine tune our database over time. And we can create different key features. And I'll dive into a little bit more where we're taking this here in a second. But this allows us quite a bit of insight into what our databases are doing from a workload perspective. And finally, as I'd like to mention again, we have full documentation and support implementation as well. Let's go ahead and bounce back over really quick so that we'll have some time for questions. And let's take a look at the roadmap. So as I mentioned before, we are wanting to create SkySQL as a multi-cloud, multi-platform database as a service. And in order to do that, we've used Kubernetes to be able to provide it that scalability and flexibility that you'd expect. And so over time, we're going to be adding features like AWS support and Azure support. We're going to be able to cluster using Galera, Shard using Spider. And we're going to dive even deeper into this idea of workload analysis to hopefully get to this point where databases are self-optimizing and you're getting this idea of being able to optimize automatically in combination with being able to scale automatically. And to wrap things up, I'd like to mention again that we are offering a $500 credit to go ahead and get started with SkySQL. So as you've seen with the resource allocations, you can spin up a pretty small instance and be able to stretch that pretty far to get a great idea of how SkySQL can help you in the capabilities that it's offers. So I highly suggest anybody who's interested, go out there, it's completely risk-free, and go ahead and take a look. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. I put a couple of links on here. The source that I provided for, or the examples that I put up today, there's many more out there as well, but they're all on GitHub at github.com/MariaDB-corporation/developer-examples. And I've got a variety of them that highlight different features, not only within MariaDB, but in SkySQL as well. And you can feel free to contact us at developers@mariadb.com, hit us up on Twitter, or reach out to us directly on GitHub and take a look at all the open source opportunities that we have out there. And with that, I think I'd like to transition to some questions. Yeah, so the first question I have here is, where is SkySQL hosted? And for that, I mentioned it briefly within the slide before, and I'll actually pop that back up here, is currently we have SkySQL is hosted out in Google Cloud Platform. But of course, as I mentioned, with Kubernetes and the compute engines for each of the big cloud platforms, we're actually going to be moving into AWS and Azure very soon. Next, it looks like Azure and AWS both provide MariaDB cloud options. What are the benefits of using SkySQL? Now, this kind of backs all the way up into kind of previous slides or the beginning slides where I mentioned that Azure uses something called Azure databases and AWS uses RDS for relational database services. And they provide MariaDB, but unfortunately they provide only the community versions of MariaDB. And so you're missing out on several crucial bug fixes that have happened within the last year or even 2 years if you look at the version of community that's on Azure databases. And so you're missing out on a lot of the current features and bug fixes and security fixes that are available. Now, beyond that, really, there is this idea of polished quality support. And MariaDB, obviously, as the creators of MariaDB database, are probably the most qualified for being able to resolve and fix issues directly within the source of MariaDB. And so not only are you looking at the difference really between enterprise and community, but you're actually looking at ongoing support and a lot of that ongoing consulting ability provided by MariaDB itself. Let's see. Can I use a client like SkySQL with SkySQL? Yeah, so I showed in the example that I could only actually use, or I showed in the example, sorry, that I was using the MariaDB client, but you're really not, prevented from using any of the clients that you may now already use for MariaDB. You can actually use those directly with SkySQL. Now, the configuration may be a little bit different because of things like the certificate authority chain file or that .pim file that I mentioned and dropped in there in the example. But the good news is that in that enterprise and SkySQL documentation that I also mentioned, we provide several examples with a variety of different clients that we've gone through and tested ourselves, and provide all the steps to walk through and be able to connect to MariaDB SkySQL. The version of MariaDB SkySQL, and I don't think that I mentioned that, the version that is currently out on SkySQL right now is 10.4, and we're calling it MariaDB X4 as the platform right now. If you compare that to AWS RDS, they're using currently, actually I think they are using 10.4, and Azure Databases is using 10.3. But the most important thing to note here is that within a couple of months, we're actually going to be pushing out or publishing MariaDB 10.5, so MariaDB X5 platform, which is going to come with a ton of new features and obviously several new bug fixes and a bunch of new capabilities. And it looks like with that, I actually have reached the ends of the question Q&A portion, but certainly if you have any questions after this, feel free to reach out to me directly, or you can hit us up at developers@mariadb.com.
Perfect. Thank you for answering those questions, Rob. And with that, I would like to thank you for a great presentation. And I would also like to thank MariaDB for providing the audience with a great webinar. Lastly, thank you to everyone who attended today. We hope you learned something new that will help you in your developer career. Have a great day.